Hello and welcome to the shed. In today's video I wanted to talk you through the beginner tools that are required to get started in hand tool woodworking. Hope you enjoy. So my plan for this video is that I'm going to walk around, we'll look at some of the tools that I've got up here on the wall, and we'll choose a few options so you can have a few options of what you could get, and we'll just talk through why I believe you require these tools to begin your woodworking journey. So come in. We're first going to start with markouts and layout. So let's jump in and get to it. When it comes to markout and layout, we obviously need some way of writing on our pieces of wood measurements, where we're going to cut them and the like. So we're going to start with marking out tools. So what I'm going to start with here is pencils and pens and the like. Now, if you're going to go with pencils like this, a nice sharp point is very useful. If you're going to use a biro like this, you're probably not going to have a very sharp point, but the Japanese use a lot of ink. I know they can get them sharper than what a ballpoint can because they're using fountain pens and things like that traditionally. And you've also got things like the mechanical pencil here, which has a very sharp lead all the time. They're the options. Now, just on another note, I just wanted to cover, if you want to get a nice sharp point like this one here, I can recommend this sharpener that Paul Sellers recommended years ago, and this is a Swordfish Pointy, and it gives a very, very sharp point on your pencil, which means that you can get very accurate markings with just a standard lead pencil. I'll leave a link to that below if you're interested in checking it out. Next, we want to measure things. So we need something like a ruler. So when it comes to rulers, I have a couple of different options out here, and we'll cover a third when we move on to the squares, because there's another piece of kit there that covers this as well. So just your standard metal 30cm ruler, or something a little more fancy, one of these fold out rulers will get you done, or in a pinch, just a tape measure. But I'm looking at these because when you're doing layout of joinery, you actually want something that's a little more accurate, and I find that the tape measure is not quite accurate enough. But if you're just starting, the tape measure will probably get you started and get you going. Next, we're going to look at squares, because obviously when we're marking to cut bits of wood, we need some nice square lines so we can accurately cut joinery and cut our boards to length. So there's a couple of options that we have here. Now they come in various sizes. Vintage ones, sort of like this one, which is mainly just sort of a tri-square. It's not going to get you a 45 on this particular one. Some of them do, but this one's only going to do a straight 90-degree across the board. And then we have something a little more modern, like the combination square, and now these are actually really machinist squares, and they've been adopted into woodworking and they work really well. You have a ruler on the top here that can slide back and forward, so you get different size squares for doing joinery in different spots. You get your 90-degree angle. On the other side of this, you get a 45-degree angle, and you can use this as kind of a depth gauge. You can also use it, say you're running a line down the side of a board, you can set a smaller gauge and just use a pencil to mark that. This one was a complete set, and it also came with another couple of attachments. This one's like a compass attachment, so you can actually choose any angle that you would like. And this little attachment here is a center finder, because you have your ruler running through here, put it up onto a square and you can mark a line that way, mark a line the other way, and find center. These all come in different sizes. I have another more traditional one like this, which is just a little itty bitty one. You can get other machinist ones that are completely metal in this styling. So you just need to look around and see what you can find. Just on another note, if you're looking for vintage tools, when it comes to squares or even cheaper combination squares, they might not be 100% square. So I'm going to do a video showing you all about how to make sure that your squares are square and how to fix them up if they're out of square, so you can actually get to work and have it as accurate as you can. Next, we need to use marking gauges quite often, because they're easier to use and reference to do things like mortises and straight cuts right down a board, you can actually just put a marking line there and then cut to that line. Or put that marking line, put a pencil in it, and then cut to that line, and it's going to be more accurate because it's actually cut in the piece of wood. So I have these two styles. I have this Marple's wooden style, I have this wheel style here, and just in here I actually have a very basic footprint style. Most traditional style, and you'll see the most of, is this style, which just got essentially a nail hit in there and a movable fence, so you can get your markings and accurately pull that right around a whole board. Then we have something that is still quite traditional, and that is a mortising gauge, because you need to mark two parallel lines when you're marking a mortise. So we need a gauge that's got two pins. Now, this particular one is quite fancy. It's got a little threaded piece here which allows you to get more accurate movement between these two pins so they don't slide around, because it's only moving on this. And then you've got the lockable fence. Now this one, it actually does both, because it's got a single pin on the other side. So if you're looking for this sort of style, you can get away with doing both your mortise marking and just your standard marking gauge markings. And then what I consider a little more modern is the wheel gauge. Now some of these do go back a very long way, but this is not one of them. This one is actually a very decent one from the Cat's Moses woodworking tool store. Now the reason I like this one is that it's got this micro adjustment collar here, and you've got two knurled lockdown nuts here. So the way this works is you bring it up roughly where you're going to get, and with these styles, because this is flat, your measurement comes right to the end here, and any of your markings has a flat edge on the good side you want to keep, and normally a little tapered cut because of the shape of the wheel on the off cut side, so you actually get a very accurate marking. Whereas with these pin styles, it kind of scrapes a V channel just because of the way the nail is, and you sometimes get a little bit of that on your waist side, so you just got to bear in mind that and maybe make a little allowance for that. Now with these wheel gauges, particularly this one, you can come in and you can lock this back collar, and then you can micro adjust your measurements to exactly where you want with this adjustment here. So you can see this is not moving, only the head that's moving here, and then when you find it, you lock that down and you can get a very accurate reading. The other advantage you have with these is you can use them as a depth gauge as well, just like the combination, but it's a lot smaller, so you can get right in. And even with that blade, you can clear out the bottom of a mortise using it at the right depth. But the advantage that I wanted to show you that you have with this style is, say you want to get the thickness of this top piece, this top board, you can run it on here, let that drop down to your bench or another piece of flat stock, tie it off, and now you've got that exact measurement. Now this is useful when doing things like dovetails. So one last thing we might want to look at when it comes to marking out, other than the pencil, is knives. Now some people use them, some people don't. I like using them. They get very accurate walls on your joinery when you're marking, and they're very definitive. They don't move, and it's a very accurate point where you can reference things like chisels and stuff, especially on something like dovetails. So they do have their advantages to use, and I definitely use them, and most woodworkers out there do. Now we have a couple of different types. You have this sort of arrow style here. Now this has two bevels on the front, so it means that you can mark one side of a tool, turn it over, mark the other side, and you've got a flat reference on the back for your markings on either side of say a square. You can reference flat that side, you can turn it around and reference flat the other side. Now the other type you have are these double beveled ones. This one's like a scalpel type, but it doesn't really matter what double bevel knife you have. It's a more traditional style of knife. The only thing you have to do when you're marking with these is actually tilt it away so you're actually referencing on the bevel rather than just flat down, so you get a very accurate marking. But we'll cover some more on how to use marking knives in another video. But for now, marking knives. And there's a whole host of other things here. Now, if you're just getting started and you're doing dovetails and stuff, there are specialist little squares you can buy, but I would recommend not doing what I did and actually buy a dovetail marking jig, so you can just put it on and you've got the cross marking and your angle. And I think as a beginner that's doing dovetails, that's where you should probably begin. We have sliding bevels and things, but I don't think that needs to be part of your beginner kit, because you're probably not doing a whole bunch of random angles where you need something like the sliding gauge. However, you can use one of these if you want to for marking your dovetails, but I do recommend the jigs, so they're going to be a lot easier for you to work with. We've done our mark out, we've done our layout. We now need something to cut along our lines to do our joinery and also just to cut our wood to length. So I've just gone and grabbed a handsaw. Now, most of you probably are familiar with something like this, a hardware handsaw, plastic handle, impulse hardened teeth, you can't sharpen them, big plastic handle, which makes it much harder to control, but it does the job. Most of them are set to a rip cut like this particular one is. Some of them have hybrid teeth. It just depends on what you find at your hardware store. Now, you can start with one of these, certainly, but we're going to delve a little deeper and we'll explain just a few of the differences between the different types of handsaws and why I recommend that you perhaps keep this, but maybe add some additionals to it. And if you can find some vintage ones to restore, and I've got videos on how to restore handsaws and how to sharpen them below, we'll add to this toolkit. But certainly, this saw can get you started. So if we look over here, I have a few different saws obviously up here on the wall. I have some Japanese styles, which I've only personally been using for a few months, and I will review them. We've got our full hand saws down the bottom here in both rip and crosscut, and I'll explain what they are in a minute. And then I've got some tenon saws and a gent saw. So let's start with the standard long saw, the rip saw. So what a rip saw is designed for cutting with the grain of your timber. They're essentially a series of chisels along here. I know it's a little difficult to see, but they're essentially a series of chisels, and these chisels are sitting here and they're offset slightly, and that's called set, so that the tooth edge is wider than the back of your handsaw blade, so it doesn't get jammed while you're cutting. A lot of you have probably had problems with these jamming and bending the blade. Their set is not very good on these, and because they're so hardened you can't really adjust it and the teeth tend to snap. These ones, these vintage ones, made of spring steel, so you can readjust the set on them and you can resharpen the teeth. So a rip cut saw like this, and I'm not advocating for you buying brand new ones. If you've got the money, you can buy something like a pack saw. However, I think as a beginner, which is what I did, is I picked up some vintage ones, learned how to restore them, and then sharpen them, and you're going to end up with a better saw in the long run. So this is a rip cut saw, and this is called a crosscut saw. Now, with crosscut saws, you essentially have what we have on the top of this marking knife here, a whole bunch of little triangles. One blade is facing that way, the other one's facing that way, right the way along, so you actually have a series of knife cuts, or knives, across the top. Now, what these are designed to do is to cut across the grain, and because they've got offset again, with that set, they're still offset just like a rip cut. However, these little knives are going to sever the fibers, so when you cut across them, they're actually going to cut them and not rip them out like a rip cut would do. Now, I did also mention that there are hybrid saws, and some of these modern ones are hybrid and they've got the equivalent of a rip and a cross cut built in there. I don't think they work very well. They tend to leave a very big cut when you're cutting, so they're not as accurate. However, these saws are not going to be doing your finest work like your joinery work. These are going to be mainly cutting things to length and width. So for our joinery, we're going to start looking at our tenon saws and things like dovetail saws. This happens to be a gent saw, which is quite a cheap option in terms of like a dovetail saw. It has a very thin plate with practically no set on it. These ones are always set to a rip cut as well. So something like this is a very good option for a beginner. And then you can come up in things like these tenon saws. Now, these tend to be quite expensive, whether they're vintage or brand new. This tenon saw is actually set to a rip cut. You can get them in both rip cut and cross cut for doing your various operations. Say when you're cutting a tenon, if you're cutting down from the top of the board, you'd use your rip cut. Then when you cut the shoulder, you'd use your cross cut, and they're the options. Now, when it comes to other styles of saws like these, you have different handle types. The pistol grip ones tend to be a little more expensive, but some of the tenon saws, so the smaller tenon saws, are considered your dovetail saws. So that's just something to bear in mind. They have a very thin plate, but as a beginner, I advocate for the gent saw because it's easy to use and it's nice, cheap, and light to get the work done. Now we're going to move into the Japanese saws. Now, I believe this is a Ryoba saw style, which has both rip and cross cut. Now, these have very little set on their blades. The blades are very fine, they're very flimsy, but these are pull saws, whereas the other saws that I've just shown you, the Westerns, are push saws, so they cut on the push stroke, whereas these cut on the pull stroke. So when you're pulling towards you is when these ones are cutting. With this style, when you push away, it's cutting. So you just got to bear in mind and know how these work as you're using them to just understand and have a little sympathy of how they work. Now these style have rip cut on one side, cross cut on the other, and they are very cheap. They can be bought extremely cheap. So although I prefer the Western style saws, if you're just beginning, because these are a combination and quite cheap, this is actually a good option that could replace both of these saws with just one saw. Now, you could do a little bit of joinery with something like this. Some tenons and stuff that they're actually got quite fine cross-cut teeth and quite fine rip cut, so you can actually get away with some fine work with that. This style of saw is essentially the Japanese joinery saw or dovetail saw. It has an extremely fine plate, it has practically no set on it, and it excels for cross-cutting and also cutting dovetails. So there's some options there for you, some more expensive, cheaper, Japanese style versus Western, just to help get you started. And then we do have a few other specialty saws that you can get, things like coping saws for cutting angles, and you've got turning saws for cutting angles. But just starting out, you could add a coping saw to your list. Now, they take a little bit to get used to how to use them, and if used incorrectly, the blades can snap on these quite easily. But it's good to add this because if you're looking at some people that do dovetails, they'll use a coping saw to remove the waste. So it could be another one to add. You can pick them up pretty inexpensively, even brand new from hardware stores, and they work straight away. So I'm going to leave this one down here as another option for a saw. Now there are a lot of other saws for doing various types and different designs and different manufacturers, but as long as you get one that's working for you, even if you've restored it and it's doing the job, it doesn't really matter what the brand is. You'll get a lot of distant hand saws, which most of these are, and Spear & Jackson are another major brand that you'll see of these vintage saws. Both of them made a lot of hand saws and are both reputable makers, so you're going to have some decent quality if you try to restore them. Next, we've already cut our stuff. We now want to smooth out because these saws are all going to leave relatively rough cuts on the wood. So if we're doing just our basic rip cut or cutting to length, we're going to want to add a hand plane. Obviously, I have an awful lot of hand planes. Now, I've been doing this a while. I collect them, I like to restore them. I'm turned into a little bit of a tool collector. I like the history of the tools, so a lot of these ones are very early ones. Now, you don't have to do that. Now, just tucked away in here, I have a brand new, what's called a Stanley Bailey hand plane. Now, you can get these from hardware stores. They're not going to be the best, but they will get you started. If you can't find a vintage one or you don't have the time to restore a vintage one and you don't want to pay the premium $600 to $1,000 for the premium good quality Lee Nielsen's or Veritas hand planes. I will leave a link to this one below because there's a couple of different models of these. I advocate for this. If you can't get something else, this will get you started. And it's a number 4 hand plane. Whether it's a number 4 hand plane like that or a number 4 Stanley like one of these vintage ones, that is probably the most common hand plane you're going to see. Maybe not the most versatile, but that will get the job done. Or you can jump into something like this one here. And I'm going to cover a little bit more with the different types of hand planes and what they're used for in a later video. But you can have this one, which is called a number 5. Now, the main difference is that you can see that it's got a much longer sole on it. So that allows you to get better referencing when you're flattening the sides of boards because you're just going to skip the high points and you're going to get slightly more accuracy. But you can still do the same thing with a number 4 and say a combination square as a straight edge. They're the two that I'd recommend, and I actually did leave a video as to which one you'd buy first, so I'll leave that link down below that you can check that out. Now, the number 4 and the number 5, which are going to be the two most common, also have other variants where you have up here, you have a 4.5. It's the same length as your standard 4, but it's got a wider sole and it's got some more weight behind it, so it's going to allow you to do some more heavier stock removal a little easier. And similarly, we have something like my unrestored one here. This is a 5.5, same as the number 5, but wider. So they're probably going to be your main options in terms of hand planes when you're first starting out if you're looking at metal-bodied hand planes. Now, you also do get Japanese hand planes. I've not used them much, so I can't comment. But if we just have a quick look over here, I'm just going to show you some other options that are available in terms of wooden hand planes. They're not going to be quite as beginner friendly, so I do recommend at least one basic metal hand plane to get you started. However, wooden ones are a cheaper option, and they are available out there if you can get them working properly. And there are some good videos out there on people that exclusively use these style, so it can be done. I'm not going to say that you should do it because a lot of them out there that I collected when I was first starting just were frustrating because they didn't work properly. So let's have a look over here. Just like with your metal ones, you have smaller ones like this, which is a small smoothing coffin-shaped hand plane, so you can see that it's in the coffin style. I have a larger smoothing one, such as this one just here, and you can see you get problems like this where they jam if the wedge or the blade is not set up correctly. And I'm going to cover a few videos on these wooden ones later on, just so if you want to go down that road, I can help you out a little bit. And you also have these other longer wooden hand planes. The one I like to show off is this big long jointer. Now you're going to get some nice straight large material, very straight with one of these. I wouldn't recommend buying one of these, but it came in a set that I got which had these smaller ones, so that's why I have this. And I do pull it out from time to time and use it, but it's a little cumbersome in such a small space. I tend to hit the wall with it, so I don't use it a lot. But we do have other wooden ones like these ones. These are kind of like jack plane length, kind of in the same ilk as maybe a number 5, number 6, and you can set these up to do rough work. You can set them up to do some smoother work like you can with a number 5 hand plane. But I'm not a very good expert when it comes to the wooden hand planes, and I'm not sure, like there's certain lengths that determine whether it's a jointer or just a normal bench plane or a scrub plane, and the blade that's in it determines whether it's for rough removal or not, and the 4 planes and all that. So I'll try and leave some links down below to a few others that I've seen that actually understand this and can talk you through that if that's something that interests you. And then we also have planes like this one, which is just a smaller version of the one I'm about to show you. And you'll see these around. These are transitional planes. Now, they're definitely another option. These ones have your lateral adjusters, they have your depth adjusters like the metal ones, but they're on a wooden body. And as long as that wooden body is nice and flat, these actually work quite well and are usually picked up a lot cheaper than the metal ones. So, for just starting out, we're not doing too much complex joinery, so that covers your main bench planes for just smoothing. And there are some other options out there. We have things like the radius plane, which you're probably not going to look at this stage. That's a more advanced piece of kit that you can look at later down the track. We have things like these moving Philister planes for doing rebates. That's another option. Not probably one that I'm going to put in here as your beginner set. We have router planes. Now, some of these can be picked up cheap, some of them are quite expensive, and the versatility of the router plane, and I'm going to cover another video on the uses of the router plane and what we can use it for in a later video, but the versatility of this, I would say, if you can find one at a decent price, or a decent price to you, I'd go ahead and pick one of these up, because it does allow you to get some very good joinery done after the chisel to square out the bottom of rebates and that sort of thing. And even as Paul Sellers depicted, you can use them to actually clean off your tenons and stuff, so you're going to get better joinery if you have one of these. So we're going to put this aside as part of it. So now down here on my bench, we're starting to get a bit of a collection and ideas of what we require in a beginner kit. So we've marked our timber off, we've cut it, we've hand planed it so it's all square and nice and smooth. Now we want to screw some of it together. So we need something that can drive some screws and drill some holes. So if we're looking in the hand-powered ilk, we have things like this little egg beater drill, and ones like this, which you brace here and then spin the handle. So it's a chest drill. There are 2 options. Some of these are quite expensive, some of them are not too bad, but some of them are going to be useful to you, especially if you're doing some finer work. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't include something like any battery drill, even a plug-in power drill, but particularly these battery drills, because they're so versatile in what you can do with them, and they can drive a lot of different things. So I like to include this one in here because I know a lot of you have already got them. Whether it's a DeWalt one like this, or whether it's a cheaper hardware one, anything that works, the cheapest that you can find that does the job is going to get you started, and that is probably the old trusty battery drill, and most of you probably already have one for some of the hardware or construction work that you do around the house. And one last thing that I wanted to include is the brace. Now, you see a lot of these around, you can pick them up extremely cheap. I picked one up just the other day for $7, so it's going to need some restoration, and I'm going to do a video on that so you can see it, but I think it's important to include something like the brace. So now we've got our battery drill, our egg beater drill. We need obviously something that we can put in our brace. We need some drills that we can put in our drills, and some drivers for driving bits. Now, I have these X-Torque kits. This is just a complete drill bit kit from, what does this go down to? 1mm up to 10.5mm. You could go for a kit like this. Some of them are quite expensive. This is not the cheapest one out there. They're better quality, but you can just get cheaper hardware ones and they're going to get you started. I also have these little X-Torque bits here, and this has a whole range of flathead and Phillips head in both the PH1 through to PH3. They're the different sizes of Phillips heads. We've got some star drivers and some torque screw drivers, that sort of thing. This was a very inexpensive kit, but you can just pick up a couple of Phillips and flathead bits in various sizes to get you started. Now when it comes to the brace, you obviously need a twisted brace bit like this kit I got here. Now you don't necessarily need a full kit like this. You can pick up some vintage, just some separate ones, and you will need to learn how to sharpen them, and I do have a video where I've covered that already, so I'll leave that link down below, and I might even do a refresher in sharpening for you guys of some of these more obscure tools. But this kit here in Australia was not cheap. I'm pretty sure they're cheaper in the US and in England because there's much more of it available, but you can just pick up individuals and build your own set. So that's another option, and the reason that you want to use these ones, you want to get these ones that have the square taper for a brace, because that's what the double-jawed brace is actually designed to hold. I know you can buy some more modern ones that have circular shanks, and you can run them just in your normal chucked drill. Now, while we're on bits for drilling and for driving screws, I just want to cover one other thing. And for some of your finer work on hinges and brass screws and whatnot, you're going to probably want some screwdrivers, because the drill is going to be too powerful to do that work and might damage your screws or whatever you're working on. So something like a little Phillips head is going to be useful, obviously in different sizes again. And flathead, modern, vintage, it doesn't really matter. You've probably already got some set out there. Even if it's just a nice cheap set, it'll get you started in a pinch. We've covered marking our equipment, marking out our joinery, sawing our stuff to length, sawing our joinery, smoothing off our timber, drilling holes, driving screws. Now, there's one thing that we haven't covered yet, and that is the humble chisel. Now, probably one of the most versatile tools that you can have in your toolkit. Relatively inexpensive if you're going for hardware sets. You can totally do that, or you can go to specialist woodworking places and stores and buy specialist ones that are woodworking with all these wooden handles that look pretty. So let's just jump back up here, and I'm just going to cover what you can get in terms of chisels. So if we look up here, I have a new Japanese set that I haven't actually used much, and I can't really advocate for them yet because I haven't really used them. I'm going to be reviewing this when I get around to it, but you do see a lot of them out here, so I thought I'd cover that. And then you've got your more Western style here. These are what is considered like a 3/4 tang. So the piece of metal just comes in here, smacked into the handle. You have this piece of metal here, which is a ferrule, stops it smashing open and allows you to back it in there. This one actually has something on the top so you don't damage it if you're hitting it with a metal hammer. These just happen to be little I think leather bolster. You can also get metal ones. If we compare it to the Japanese ones, you can see that they actually have a metal one on here and they're designed to be hit. This has all been burred over the wood to actually stop that coming off. When it comes to a beginner kit, you can buy kits that are 4 or 5 chisels all the way up to 8, 10, 12. The sizes keep going up. Now as a beginner, I believe you're like I did, you're doing smaller stuff, so you don't really require a particularly large chisel. Now, I think the ones I've got here is about a 6mm, a 10mm, I think this was about a 12 or 15mm, and this is like an 18 or 20mm chisel. But you can just buy these basic sets, particularly even the hardware sets, they're going to work. The only thing they tend to have is that the steel may be not as good in some of these hardware ones versus more vintage ones. But it really doesn't matter when it comes down to it what chisels you get, as long as you've got some to get you started and that they're going to be sharp. Now, before we head on to that, we're going to talk about what we're going to use to hit these chisels. Now, few different options out there, obviously, with hammers. You've got your normal claw hammer. Now, you can definitely hit the back of your chisels with one of them. Wooden mallet, that's going to work well. And you have this style that's got the nylon heads. One's slightly spongier than the other, one's slightly harder. So your metal hammer on your Japanese chisels is going to be fine. On your hardware chisels, it's probably going to be fine because some of them actually have a complete through tang. And you're going to get away with smacking them with one of these and it's probably going to be okay. If you've got some nicer chisels like these that don't have anything on the end to protect the handle, you're going to mushroom that handle over, and that's where these two come in. The wooden mallet can be used on the wooden handles, and because you're working on the end grain of your timber, it's not really going to damage your chisel too much, and you're going to get some good throughput with something like this, some nice heavy impact with the head, especially if you've used quite a dense wood in your mallets. I wouldn't recommend buying the wooden mallets that are out on the market. I think they're too expensive, and I just don't think they've got the weight. A lot of them are made out of beech, and I don't think they've actually got the weight behind them to work properly, which is why I built this. And I've made a video on this one, so I'll leave that down below where you can check that out if you want to make one for yourself. And when it comes to this style with these nylons heads, they screw in and out. There's a lot of them available of different makers. This one happens to be the Thorax brand, the Thorax 712 on this one. This one comes with a plastic handle by stock. I took that out and put a wooden handle on it because I prefer the wooden handle. You can actually buy these ones already with the wooden handle, but they're difficult to get here in Australia. So if you can get them in your country, you can just go ahead and buy one of these and have a few different nylon heads. The other thing that's good about this is these nylon heads protect it, so when you're actually putting your joinery together, you can tap your joinery together on already finished parts and you're not going to do much damage. However, you can just use blocks and the like to protect it when you're using these other hammers. But the hammers that I would recommend when it comes to woodworking is either make your own wooden mallet or buy one of these nylon headed mallets. They're going to get you started best. But in a pinch, you can use one of these claw hammers if it's what you've already got and you can't afford to expand to other hammers when you're first starting. We are working with tools that require sharp edges, and if they're blunt, they're not going to work properly and you're going to get frustrated. I have videos on how to sharpen properly down below, so do check them out. But we need sharpening stones. Now, when it comes to sharpening, I'm an advocate for using jigs to sharpen with when you first begin. You can use the cheap ones, but I believe you're best to splash out on something like the one that I've got here. This one, it's one of the more expensive premium ones on the market. It's foolproof for a beginner and it's really not going to fail you, and it'll give you a lifetime of work if you look after it. I've done a review on it. I'll leave that link down below and let you decide for yourself, but you can buy cheaper ones that have got small wheels, and they frustrated me when I first started and gave me inaccurate results as they just didn't have the accuracy of something like this. And when I bought one of these, my sharpening transformed. Now, I'm not saying you can't sharpen without one of these. You certainly can hand-free sharpen, but one of these is just going to get you started so much easier, in my opinion. If you do want to save the cash, you can buy a cheap one. It will sort of get you started, but I'm not a big fan of them. And you can also just freehand sharpen from the beginning if that's something that you're interested in learning. I would say go ahead and do that. But otherwise, the Veritas guide is what I recommend, and it'll last you right through your woodworking career. Next, we need some sort of abrasive to sharpen. Whether that's something like I've got here, which is just wet and dry sandpaper on a piece of melamine, that will work. It's good for just starting out if you don't want to fork out for stones. Now, there are so many different types of sharpening stones out on the market. These ones I've got here are a bit more of a premium water stone. I did do a video a few weeks ago on the differences between water stones and diamond stones and oil stones and the differences in price points. So I'll leave that link down below for you to check out if you're interested to delve a little deeper. But all you need to know for now is that you need some sort of sharpening system that's going to work for you in terms of water stones, oil stones, diamond stones, or sandpaper. You just need to find something that works for you. And the cheapest option in terms of stones when you first start out tends to be oil stones. However, you're going to find that they're slow and a little frustrating as you advance in your woodworking career or in your woodworking. So that's something you're going to have to decide for yourself. So do check that video out to help you decide. And then along with the sharpening is a strop. Just a piece of leather stuck to something that's flat. Now the whole purpose of this leather is it can hold a honing compound, which is a very fine grit that allows you to polish up your chisels. So if we look at some of these chisels, see how the edge is extremely shiny? That's done with a strop. And this is invaluable in keeping your tools sharp, meaning that you have to go back and sharpen them less. And it's just going to get the job done. It prevents you having to buy all these expensive, very high grit stones. And I did cover this once again, but this is a definite mainstay in any beginner's kit. You just get a little piece of off-cut leather, whether that's from a sofa or wherever, and get started. There's one last thing we need to cover in terms of something that's beginner that we need to start with, and that's some way of pushing bits of wood together, holding them together while we glue them and the like, and that is clamps. Now there are a variety of different clamps out there, some of them extremely expensive. I don't advocate for any of the expensive ones, I just try and use the cheapest ones that are available. Now we have ones like this, which if you know Paul Sellers, he uses ones very similar to this. This one happens to be iron grip, and they were quite difficult to get here in Australia, but I found a supplier, and that is Sydney Tools. They sell these iron grip ones. I've modified them to make them stronger, like Paul Sellers suggests, with a bit of pine, which just makes them make less noise and makes them feel a little better in the hand and a little stronger. Now that's one option of a clamp. Now you can get these in various sizes. This one's just the smallest one they had available, which I think was 600 mil, something like that. And the other one that you're going to use a lot of, and when you're first starting out, is F clamps. They're a very good option as well. And wooden screw clamps can be, but they're less versatile, so I'm not going to cover them in the beginner kit. That's something that you can advance into. They're relatively cheap, so you can always pick one up and try it for yourself. But this bar style, you're probably going to want 4 or 5 of these to help pull things together, and a few of these to help keep things together if you're working on smaller items as well. So as you can see, I just wanted to keep it very simple with the clamping, because we don't want to waste a lot of money on clamps that we may or may not use. You're better to get specialist clamps when you need them, when you're going to use them. Now there is one other clamp that I like to use, and that is just a very basic corner clamp like this. Now that's just going to allow you to hold 2 pieces of wood together if you want to drill some screws in, just so they don't move while you do that, so you can get your hands free. Now this one's just a very simple framing one that I picked up from my local auto parts store, actually, as it happens, and it was like $12, so they're not going to break the bank, so you can get a couple of these that help you when you're framing things together. That's pretty much an overview of what I consider the basic toolkit. Now what I want to do is we want to go back and look at these, and we'll remove some of them out, and we'll just get down to the very bare basics kit that we can get, with a few optional extras available if you feel that you want to, but I just want to get the most bare bones kit for you as a beginner. So we can see we have a lot of tools here. Thinking, well, this is going to get quite expensive if we're going to have all these tools. And in actual fact, the majority of these are vintage or restored tools, or stuff that I built myself, so they're not too expensive. Some of them are a little bit more than others, but we're going to get the cheapest basic kit together here that we can. So we've got marking, pens and pencils. They're cheap. You can have as many of them as you like. It's not really a problem. When it comes to marking knives, what would I choose? Well, if you've already got some pocket knife, the double bevel will work. But if you're going to get a specialist one, these diamond ones are what I would go for, and I'd recommend going for one of them. They're fairly cheap and they're going to be much easier as a beginner. So we can keep the ruler there since you've probably already got one anyway, but if not, and you're going to go for something like the combination square, that counters it out. But as a beginner, I believe the combination square is best. So I think we're going to take the ruler out because we're going to get accurate measurements on here. We can take the other squares out, but there's nothing stopping you adding a few extras of these in at some other point. So we're going to keep the ruler as an optional extra, and we're going to go straight with the combination square. I think you need some sort of mortise. If you're not doing mortises straight up, just the wheel gauge is the best. So I'm going to keep two options here. One of a mortise if that's what you require. Some of these wheel ones come with mortise attachments. So if you've got one of them, you could stick with just the wheel that's got the mortise attachments, or you're going to want a mortise gauge along with that. So I'm going to keep two here because you can never have too many gauges. It's useful to set a couple for different operations that you're doing. Chisels, full set, single set. You could just get away with something like a 10mm chisel if you just wanted to buy one that was better. But if you've got some vintage ones, 3 or 4 chisels is not going to break the bank, especially if it's a hardware set. So we're going to keep that full chisel set here. So we're going to keep a few clamps around because we're definitely going to need a few clamps. Now these are, like I said, you can go for some quite cheap ones with these, and that's a good option to at least have 2 or 3 clamps. Now while we're here, we're going to look at sharpening. So you're definitely going to want to keep some sort of sharpening stone set, whether that's sandpaper and a strop, or a water stone or a diamond stone and a strop. And I'm also going to keep my Veritas gauge here because I honestly believe that's the best and it's going to get you the best results and prevent frustration. So when it comes here, we're probably going to keep just the Japanese joinery saws, and I like to keep like maybe one Western saw. The gent saw is what I really like, but depending on what you go for, you can go for either. So what we're going to do here is make the choice. I would keep one rip cut saw and the gent saw if we were going Western. If we're going Japanese saws in the basics, I'd just keep one of each of these because they're going to work really well. And coping saw, we're going to keep that in the optional extras category as it's not 100% necessary. Now we're moving on to a hammer. You need to choose a hammer of some sort. So for the sake of this kit, I'm going to keep this nylon covered hammer, mainly because it's quite versatile and quite soft on everything that you're working. It can be used for assembly and for your chisels. Next, we're going to move on to our hand planes. Now, this is really personal preference, but if I had to choose one, I would probably go with the number 5, just because of the versatility that you can get out of with the longer sole. If I was going to go with a number 4, I'd go with probably the brand new Stanley Bailey, or if you can get a vintage one to restore. Either or. For the sake of this set, just so we get less tools on the bench here, I'm going to take the number 4 away and leave the number 5 because I believe that's a little more versatile. And I'm going to keep the router plane here if you can get a hold of one, because that's going to 4x your work. It's going to make it so much easier to do some of your tasks. Coming down to the drills, if you're just beginning, we're probably not going to use any of these. The brace is nice to have, so we're going to keep that as an optional extra. But if you've already got your battery drill, that's probably what I'd recommend over these, just because these are harder to work with, especially if you're by yourself, harder to do tasks one-handed, and just a little more complicated to use. So I'm going to keep the battery drill here. Now along with that, you need some sort of drills, some sort of drivers. So we're going to leave these here. That's really up to you as to what you get for that, and you can spend as much or as little as you want. Then with the screwdrivers, just a couple of screwdrivers, whether that's hardware ones, some flathead and Phillips, is going to be useful in your kit. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to settle this together so we compact it up, and I'll show you a few of the honourable mentions that if your budget can spread to, you'd be good to have as part of this kit. So as you can see, we've dropped this down to a lot less tools here now, more compact. You can fit it straight into the toolbox and you'd be good to go. With our marking pencils, we have our square, our gauges, our chisels, sharpening, hammer, hand plane and router plane, hand saws, clamps, screws and drills, and driving along here as well. So to this kit, if your budget can spread and it's not going to be that expensive and you want to bore larger holes, the brace and a set of bits is another good addition that we can add in here. Coping saw to speed up dovetails, that's very useful, and an additional ruler, and we could add a straight edge into this equation as well. Now, I didn't mention the straight edge before because you don't really need it if you're working on smaller stuff, and you can get by using your combination square as that straight edge, or if you've added the extra ruler, you can use that as your straight edge as well. So that's another optional extra that just makes life a little bit easier. So there you have it, folks. That's what I believe is my beginner set that I believe everyone should have at least one or two of options within these, and you can go for the cheapest or a little bit better quality depending, or going for a restoration depending on what it is. And then some optional mentions as some extras that we could add in here that just make things a little more comfortable and a little more easy to do certain tasks. So let me know below what you guys think. Have I missed anything in this beginner set? Have I added stuff that you wouldn't add, or that you don't believe that I should have in this set? Please let me know in the comments below what you would add to it or remove from this beginner set, so we can help out the beginners out there watching this video to help choose their tools and save money on things that they don't really need to get started. So if you like this video, please consider liking and subscribing down here. It really does help the channel out. And if you'd like to support me a little bit further, please consider checking me out on Patreon. That's www.patreon.com/aussiewoodshed. Links in the description below. And if you'd like to see some more videos related to hand tools, please check out these videos on the screen here right now. Bye for now.